Good morning. Good morning. This room is beautiful. The energy is positive. It just feels great to be here, and I know I needed this today, and I'm sure many of you are feeling the same. I'm Blythe Robinson. I am the president of IWF Georgia, and thank you. And I'm excited to welcome you to our International Women's Day event. We're in for a very exciting and inspiring and thought-provoking day today. But before we get started, I just want to acknowledge a few women. First, thank you to our chair of International Women's Day, Susan O'Farrell. Where are you? Thank you, and thank you to the full events committee for planning this awesome day. I also want to thank Roxanne Douglas, who is one of our past presidents who started the International Women's Day event. Thanks to her vision, here we are, years later, celebrating just this phenomenal day. So I want to shout out Roxanne and thank her, as well as some of our past presidents who are also in the room. Thank you to our sponsors, who you will hear more about throughout the program. This day would not be possible without your generosity. And lastly, I want to give a big thank you to all of our speakers in advance. Let's clap for them now, because I know that they spent a lot of time planning their remarks and their conversations and their discussions that are going to be very rich today. So thank you. And I get to hand things over to our amazing MC for today, Saleemah Abdul-Ghafur, who does not want me to do a long introduction, so I will respect that. But I will say that she is an accomplished leader with extensive experience in global policy, advocacy, and communications. She is a community leader with a strong commitment to and passion for civic engagement through activism, volunteerism, and advocating for gender equality. She is a board member for IWF, and I get to have the pleasure of working with her. Let's welcome Saleemah to the stage.
Thank you, that was perfect. If you're in this room, you have a long bio, and you can Google it. So why? Am I, it's the truth, right? Welcome, welcome, welcome. IWF International Women's Day. This is the 6th one, and this one is the most attendees that we've ever had. So we have a full room here, we're expecting more people, and we've got dozens of people online as well. So obviously, we're serving a need. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you, Blythe. Thank you to the IWF board. Thank you to the committee who's worked tirelessly to put this event on. Thank you all for sacrificing the time out of your day. This is a unique event for IWF. It's one of the only ones where we actually go beyond our membership and invite other members of the public, and we welcome you and are grateful that you're here. This is a program that is designed to support the IWF Fellows Program. The fellowship is an incredible and competitive offering from IWF Global that gives rising star women a year-long continuing education and leadership training course that can act as a powerful springboard in their careers. We have a number of powerhouse fellows in the room. I want them to stand up so that we can recognize them. These are our IWF GA fellows, and on your screen, you'll see a list of all of the IWF fellows. So what do we have in store today? People look pretty happy. I feel celebration in the air. I feel happiness, but I also know that we're going to get a push notification like momentarily, and that feeling may go out the window. How are people feeling today? How are you feeling? What's going on? Shout out a word. Word. Joy, stress. What else? No wrong answers. I mean, I'm in, you know, perimenopause, and I go from stress to joy inside of a second. So, but that's exactly right. Other feelings out there. Hopeful. Resolved. Women. Wealth. Great women. Resilient. There's a, what was that? Concerned. Understatement, yeah. Disappointment. Power. All right, I'll end on that. Thank you. No wrong answer. This is how it is. This is how it is. This is how we feel. So I want to say a few words before we get into the program. We'll put my glasses on because that's also a feature of my life these days. Yay. A lot of stress in the system. We can't ignore it. And even though we can be joyful and hopeful, for many people in this room, in our community, in our country, in our world, this is a stressful time. I'm 50, and I don't remember. Yes! It just started getting good. It just started getting good. I'm 50, and I don't think I've ever witnessed the level of disruption in a public sense that I'm witnessing right now. It's a first for me, the amount of disruption and transformation. I also must honestly acknowledge that I'm clear that while half of folks may be welcoming this disruption, the other half are not. It is a stressful time for some, it is not for others. And that is a facet of what it is. So of course I was like, what am I gonna wear today? How do I dress for these times? Is it a gold lame dress? Is it flannel pajamas, you know, camouflage? And I was like, you know what? I'm gonna wear this dress, and I'm gonna wear these shoes because they remind me of beauty and comfort, and that's what I'm leaning into. And while I do that, I acknowledge that these are heavy times. And for many of the women in this room, these are heavy times. If you're a business owner, you may be wondering how you're going to make payroll. If you lead an agency or a corporation, you're a federal worker, you might be wondering if you're going to be sacked, if you'll have any say in it, if your staff will be sacked. You might be wondering if you're going to be displaced. Whether you're a woman in the Pacific Palisades and you've been run out by fire, or you're a woman in Palestine and you've been run out by war. Or you're still wondering if AI is a friend or a foe, if it's going to displace you or leverage you or complement you. These are stressful times. I feel it, and I know some of you feel it as well. And while I acknowledge that many don't like the what and the how of these changes, again, I must acknowledge that there are many in our society who like these changes and who believe they'll put us on a path to a better way forward. The zeitgeist reflects a deep division. I also know that if you're in this room, you are both privileged and you are powerful. We are privileged and we are powerful. We run boards, we run businesses, we run households. We control vast sums of resources, and now, more than ever, we are the ones for this moment. We in this room must use our skills and our talents. We online must use our skills and our talents in new ways to meet this moment. The World Economic Forum and Forbes magazine say that we're already in a financial revolution. It's called the Great Wealth Transfer. Have you heard about this? Yes, of course you would. Essentially, the silent generation and baby boomers are leaving massive sums of wealth to Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. This has already started, and it's going to continue for the next 25 years. And women in the US stand to be some of the greatest beneficiaries. By 2030, it's estimated that women will have control of over $30 trillion, T as in Tom, trillion dollars in assets. How will we use our power? Today, we're going to generate a powerful conversation about women, our wealth, and our power. And as we sit in this uncomfortable moment of disruption and transformation, we are going to model the civil discourse that is so urgently needed in our world right now. And my personal commitment for this entire day is radical listening, engaged and active listening, listening with respect and with curiosity. And I invite you to join me in it. Lastly, I'll say, we are moving into a sacred time for the world's Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Ramadan begins tomorrow. It will be followed by Eid, and then we'll celebrate Easter and Passover. It's no coincidence that the world's Abrahamic faiths are celebrating sacred moments at the same time. As women come together to observe and to celebrate and to commune, we'll begin here with a radical conversation on women, wealth, and power. Thank you. It's gonna be a great day. Okay, so first I wanna make sure that everyone has a notebook, lime green, a gift from our member, Amanda Brown Olmsted. If you didn't get one at the door. You may wanna jot down some notes. You're gonna hear a lot of data today. You're gonna hear a lot of information, and you're gonna wanna take this back. So if you don't wanna use your phone, use a notebook, or you can gift it to someone. If you didn't get one, there's plenty more. So now I'm welcoming Sotto Vocce. Sotto Vocce. Welcome to the stage. This is Sotto Vocce, students from Agnes Scott College. Welcome, lady. Welcome.
Singing in the dead of night. Take these broken wings and learn to fly. All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to arise. Blackbird singing in the dead of night. Take these sunken eyes and learn to see all your life. You were only waiting for this moment to be free. Blackbird fly, blackbird fly into the light of a dark black night. Blackbird fly, blackbird fly into the light of a dark black night. Blackbird singing in the dead of night. Take these broken wings and learn to fly. All your life, you were only waiting for this moment to arise. You're only waiting for this moment to arise. You're only waiting for this moment to arise.
What happens when a woman takes power? What happens when she won't back down? What happens when a woman takes power? What happens? What happens?
What happens when a woman takes power? What happens when she won't back down? What happens when a woman takes power? What happens? What happens? What happens when a woman takes power? What happens when she won't back down? What happens when a woman takes power?
What happens when she wears the crown? Whoa. What happens when she rules her own body? Whoa. What happens when she sets the beat? What happens when she runs nobody? What happens when she stands on her own 2 feet? What happens when a woman takes power? What happens when she won't back down? What happens when a woman takes power? What happens? What happens? What happens when a woman takes power? What happens when she won't back down? What happens when a woman takes power? What happens when she wears the crown? Whoa, we rise above, whoa, we lead with love, whoa, we have one, we are one, we just begun, whoa, we rise above, whoa, we lead with love, whoa, we have one, we are one, we just begun. What happens when a woman takes power? What happens when she won't back down? What happens when a woman takes power? What happens? What happens? What happens when a woman takes power? What happens when she won't back down? What happens when a woman takes power? What happens? What happens? What happens when a woman takes power? What happens when she won't back down? What happens when a woman takes power? What happens? What happens? What happens? What happens? What happens when she wears the crown?
Thank you. Agnes Scott, Sotto Vocce. What happens when a woman takes power? What happens when a woman takes power? Good things. Good things. What happens when a woman takes power? Thank you. Agnes Scott, singer, Sotto Vocce. Okay, so if you're on social media, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, you can post under IWD 2025, hashtag IWD 2025. Those online, those in a room. That is our social media handle. Let's move right to our first panel. So we're going to start by setting the context. Where are women economically here in the country, around the world? And so we've got a fantastic panel. It's going to have 3 powerhouse talent, some that we know, some that are new to us, and we're extremely excited to hear this. So we'll have Liz Everett Krisberg, who is head of Bank of America Institute and deputy director of Bank of America's Global Research, first, who'll present data and analysis from across the bank and the world to provide timely perspectives on the economy, sustainability, and global transformation. Liz has degrees from Cornell University and the Wharton School. Liz will present first, and then we'll have a full panel moderated by our own Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, President Emerita of Spelman College, and recent interim president of Mount Holyoke College. Dr. Tatum has degrees in psychology and religion from University of Michigan, Hartford Seminary, and Wesleyan. They'll both be joined by Dr. Janelle Williams, who is the co-founder and CEO of Kindred Futures. Dr. Williams is committed to closing the racial wealth gap. She was a principal advisor with the Community Economic Development Team at the Federal Reserve Bank here in Atlanta, and she holds a doctorate in International Family and Community Studies from Clemson. I welcome Liz to the stage, and then they'll be followed by Dr. Janelle and Dr. Beverly.
Thank you so much. You can find out everything by just Googling my bio, but the one thing that you maybe can't find out is that Blythe Robinson and I went to middle and high school together. So that was a great surprise to come down here. It's so wonderful to be down in Atlanta. Thank you for having me. We're talking about women, wealth, and power, and where do women stand, and why, and where are we going to go? So let's start that conversation with a little bit of context, and let me start, before we get to that, with a little bit of context around why I am here, and I'm qualified to give you any context. I am the head of something called the Bank of America Institute, and we launched about 3 years ago, and what we are is a think tank within the bank that leverages data to uncover insights and to share those insights with really everybody. We don't just share these insights internally within the bank across our lines of business. We don't just share them with our clients, but we have a broader public-facing mandate. And we share these insights with policymakers, with community leaders, really with all of you, with everybody. But the concept here is that we think we have better information, and if you have better information, you can make better decisions, and we can all have better outcomes. What we talk about is the economy, sustainability, and transformation, but the economy is by far the biggest of those pillars. And if we flip to the next slide, I'll tell you the real differentiator about what we do is our data. Just to give you a sense, just on the consumer side, we have almost 70 million consumer clients. So it's a pretty statistically significant sample size. Certainly better than a poll of, say, 500 or even 5,000 people. It is very powerful, and it allows us to uncover not just what people say they're doing, but what they actually are doing. And so of those almost 70 million consumer clients, again, on the consumer side, we had 1.3 trillion of deposits that sit with us that we can understand how that's being used. There was 4 trillion of payments that went through last year. And we're not just talking about looking at credit and debit card spending, which is important, but if you really want to get a sense of what's going on across the entire household, you have to understand not just credit and debit card spending, which is 80% of the transactions, but only 20% of the dollars. You need to understand what's really going on with all of the payments. Because if you think about it, some of households' largest expenses aren't put on their credit cards. Their rent, their loan payments, their mortgages. And we can look at that, and we can look at that in real time. So how is the consumer doing? And if we flip to the next slide, and this is just the overall US consumer, I would use the word solid. I might also use the word that was shouted out before in terms of how people are feeling today, resilient. And this might surprise some people, given some of the headlines that we're reading in the press, but looking at the data, looking at the actual data, we're seeing kind of solid momentum, maybe even more than cautious optimism. We're actually seeing this in the credit and debit card spending. So if you can see in January, card spending was up 1.9%, almost 2%. That is 3 times the average rate of spending over the last year. So that's pretty solid. Now, seasonally adjusted, it was down a lot in January, down a little bit in January. Part of that had to do with the weather. I don't need to tell you January weather was crazy. You guys had snow and ice twice, right? That happened really kind of all over the country. You had the polar vortex in the Northeast and the Midwest. You had the fires in LA. But in general, you still had pretty solid spending. In terms of what people are spending on, the answer is definitely still more of a services story than goods. And some of you may be saying, okay, Liz, spending is up because of inflation. And that is part of the story. But I would argue that what we're seeing in our data actually argues that it's not just inflation the reason that things are going up. And that's for two reasons. First, on the next slide, consumers still have savings. So this chart, it's a little noisy, but this chart looks at what the median checking and savings deposit is within households. And you can see, since the pandemic, we are seeing households' checking and savings deposits, the median level, is up north of 30% relative to where it was before the pandemic. Now, inflation adjusted, that's that dotted line, you're still seeing households across all generations have their deposit buffers are strong. So people have buffers to continue to drive some of this momentum. But the most important reason, and I think this is the key reason if you want to understand what's going on in the economy, the most important reason, if we flip to the next slide, is the labor market, is the job market. And this chart shows wage growth. And what we're seeing here is that wage growth is not only positive, which is important, but in January it accelerated across all generations. So across all generations, we saw wage growth go from 2% to 3% in January. Clearly, you can see there's a difference in terms of which generations have more. So Gen Z was up 10%, millennials were north of 5%, but in average, everybody was up. And I think that that's really important because this then provides that backdrop, provides that support for the solid, for the resilient, for the cautious positive momentum in terms of spending. So that's big picture context of what's going on in the overall economy in the US. But what's going on with women? How are women doing? So this may surprise you too, but women are leading the charge. So if we flip to the next slide, this looks at spending growth for men and women over the last 5 years. And what you can see here, the women are red, the men are blue. The women are red because I went to Cornell, so red is always a good color. Always a good color. But discretionary spending for women has outpaced men by 20 basis points for the last 2 years. And for every year here, except for 2022, really women were outpacing men in terms of spending. Why is that? What's the key to understanding this? The same thing I talked about before, understanding the labor market. So what do we know about the labor market between men and women? What are the trends there? Well, women's employment growth is outpacing men's employment growth and really outpacing the national average. Now, the growth has fallen slightly relative to pre-pandemic levels. And when I say slightly, it's 1.62% growth versus 1.63. So, it's still growing, but it's really kind of where it was pre-pandemic. Now, why is that? Digging into the details, what's going on here? If we look at sectors, different sectors, not just at our consumer data, but looking at the data from our business side, the business payments, the payroll payments for businesses in what we call women-intensive sectors. So sectors which traditionally have higher levels of female employment. So think about social services, personal services, health and educational services. In those sectors, our data is showing that payroll payments are higher than, again, the average, and we're seeing real growth since the start of 2023. And that growth is also accelerating. So this, again, supports why women are really leading the charge, why their discretionary spending is outpacing men. The other thing, and this may be perhaps unsurprising, but the labor force participation rate, which is an acronym that a lot of economists like to reference, and I don't like to say it very quickly, but the women's labor force participation rate has also seen very strong gains. So what they call prime age workers, the prime age female labor force participation rate grew 2 times as fast as men's last year. Why is that? Well, some of you may understand this. Part of it has to do with the rise in education among women. So women aged 25 to 54 are much more likely to have a bachelor's than men. 47% of women in that group have a bachelor's, only 37% of men. So you're seeing productivity in women-intensive sectors. You're seeing increases in women's gains on the education side, and that certainly is a positive. But you're also probably sitting there saying, yeah, but Liz, why aren't we getting paid the same amount as men? And we're not. So if we flip to the next slide, the labor market and income is certainly one of the drivers for consumer spending and consumer health, but we're not getting paid the same amount as men. So median earnings for women in our data was 83% of the men's median earning. Now that is a more than 5-year lag in pay parity. So why do I still have a smile on my face, kind of ish? Why am I hopeful? If I look at the Bank of America data, which is what's driving here, there's 2 things that I would point out. Again, the women's line is red, the men's is blue. Over the past 5 years, women's income is growing faster than men's. So we are catching up. And if you can see, women's income is up more than 30%, I think it's 32%, versus pre-pandemic, versus the 2019 levels. The men are under 30%. So we are catching up, we are closing that gap. It is not closed yet, but it is getting there. One of the reasons that women's, or 2 of the reasons really, that women's income is growing faster is one, what I talked about before in terms of what we see in our data, that payrolls in sectors that are traditionally more heavily employing females, that is growing faster than the average. But the second thing is we're seeing when women change jobs, and we see this in our data because we can see the income coming into accounts, where it's coming from. By the way, we do this all aggregated and anonymized. I'm not looking at your checking account. But we can see what pay jump they get when they switch jobs. And this is the difference between pay jumps when people switch jobs, between men switching jobs and women switching jobs. And you can see that at every point over the last 4 years, women are getting more when they switch jobs than men are getting when they switch jobs. And it's at the highest rate, almost 2% now, that it's been in the last 3 years. So we are closing the gap, but there are definitely still challenges. And let me just talk about one that we all are aware of, which is childcare. So if we flip to the next slide, we know that the labor force participation rate for mothers of young children is lower than those who don't have children or who have older children. We know from our data the amount of money that people are spending for childcare is up more than 30% relative to the pandemic. That is I see a lot of people nodding. That is way faster than inflation. But what we also see in our data, which I've never seen proven before, we've heard about it anecdotally, but what we can see in our data is we look at those households that were making childcare payments, and we look at how many incomes are coming into those households. And what we saw starting in 2023 is households that were making childcare payments and had multiple incomes suddenly were not making childcare payments, but also only had 1 income coming in, meaning that a parent was making the decision, not necessarily the mother, but a parent was making the decision to drop out of the workforce. Or, as you can see on the chart, on the other side, almost 40% of women cited childcare as a reason for working part-time. So this is a real challenge. This is a national challenge, and this certainly impacts women's ability to continue to contribute to our overall economy, but also their own wealth and power. Let me give you a little bit of another perspective here, because I've been talking generally about the national average, but let me talk a little bit about how this can be differentiated city to city. And some of you might think this is good news, and some of you might not believe me on this one. But this next slide shows how childcare payments, so what people are spending for childcare, how that's changing year over year, and the differences by city. And I'm sure we all have glasses, but you're still not gonna be able to read this. But Atlanta is second from the left, which means that only Boston had their child, the amount we're seeing people pay for childcare, go down in 2024, pretty significantly. Now, why is that? A couple of reasons. One, it went up a lot in 2023, so it's coming back a little bit. So that's good news for everybody here. By the way, not so good news for people in Charlotte, because they're all the way on the other side. But the other thing that's concerning is how much of this did childcare go down because of what I talked about before, that you saw people choosing to leave, get out of the workforce and therefore not make the childcare payments because of that. So childcare really is a difference, makes a difference, and we need to focus on it. Now, we have a lot more to talk about, and we're going to talk about it. So we could talk about the great wealth transfer, but should we all get to the real exciting part of the conversation as opposed to the context and what we can do about it? All right, let's do that.
Good to go? Good. Great. Well, that was really helpful, Liz. I want to thank you for sharing that information, and we do have a lot to talk about and not a lot of time, but we are going to have some time for questions. So I'm going to urge all of you to use your little green notebooks or whatever you're using to make notes, because there will be an opportunity to ask our panel some questions. I'm really pleased to be here with Liz and Janelle, and but I want to start by asking a question of the audience. And that question is, raise your hand if you were alive in 1974. Okay, a lot of you were, but not everyone. I just want to point out, not everyone.
I'm really close.
And you know, Saleemah said she just turned 50, which means she was born in 1974. I will tell you, I not long ago turned 70. I was born 20 years before, so I was 20 in 1974. And you might ask, why is she talking about 1974? I want to share with you this book, which Amy Glennon introduced to me in preparation for this session. It's called Women, Money, Power: The Rise and Fall of Economic Equality. Very provocative and really interesting, and there is a lot of historical information in the book. And here's a fact that I thought would be of interest to everyone. Until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, a bank had the legal right to refuse to give a woman a credit card based only on her sex. Credit institutions in many cases required women who were divorced, widowed, or single to have a male proxy. And credit card limits for women were generally much lower than for men. I like to say this was in my lifetime, right? You know, when we think about when you were reflecting on the current state of the economy as it impacts women, and when Saleemah was talking about how we're feeling, struggling in this difficult moment, I like to think about the fact that there have been moments more difficult. And in the 70s, we could be having a difficult moment without a credit card. Imagine that. It wasn't until 1988 that the Women's Business Ownership Act was passed. 1988, allowing women to finally obtain business financing without a male cosigner. So with that as our backdrop, I want to actually turn to you, Janelle, because I know that one of the things that you've been really focusing on is economic opportunity.
Yes.
And when we hear about the barriers for women, that's women broadly defined, of course. I have a book at home that says, all the women are white, all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave. And the title speaks to, was published in the early 80s, it speaks to intersectionality.
Yes.
You know, and as we talk about women's experience, we know that even in that broad category, we're not all having the same experience. But I'm particularly thinking about business economic opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you so much, Dr. Tatum, for the invitation, and I'm delighted to be here to spend time sharing reflections, insights. So thank you, IWF, thank you, Blythe, for the opportunity. I am a daughter of the Global South. I start by saying that because our story matters. Our stories inevitably shape our why. And I appreciate the context setting around 1974 because in 1963, my parents experienced independence for the first time as a former enslaved colony. And so when we are having conversations about power, I think it's really important that there is a structural analysis around who has power, who protects power, and who grants access to said power. My work led to leading Kindred Futures, which is a think and do tank committed to building wealth, collective Black wealth, for 2 million Black households across the American South. You might say, but why only Black people, Janelle? And that's a fair question. And so let's look at the data. Data most recently released shows that median household wealth for white families, it's $282,000. Asian American families, $536,000. Hispanic families are $62,000. And Black households are $42,000. Black median household wealth still trails all racial ethnic groups. And while there's been an increase in Black median household wealth by 66%, the dollar gap between white wealth and Black wealth is the highest it's ever been since the Federal Reserve started collecting that data. It's the highest. And so that is the data at an aggregate level. But let's talk about what that means for Black women. Because what we are seeing is that Black women are fastest growth in small businesses, fastest growth in not only college degrees, but advanced degrees and terminal degrees. But it doesn't pan out in the labor market. And so if we're having this conversation about wealth transfers and power, what we have to name is that there is power. It is also what are the opportunities for us to think about building and sharing power so that we could facilitate freedom. Because freedom truly is one's ability to determine their reality. And so as we're talking about this conversation, I'm really interested to delve in more in terms of what could we do to address these statistics, because we cannot talk about gender bias or sexism without talking about racism. It's not a real conversation.
Thank you, Janelle. You were talking about education and the way Black women are leading into business.
Yes.
And Liz, you talked about in your presentation the rapid growth in women's attainment of education.
Yeah.
I wanted to read just some statistics about that. This, of course, caught my attention as an educator, having worked in women's colleges, et cetera. In the late 1970s, college graduates earned about 40% more than high school graduates. Today, that differential stands at 90%. Not surprisingly, workers have responded. I mean, it would make sense, you know, if 90% more, go to college, right? Workers have responded to this growing wage premium by seeking more education. But as you mentioned, the proportion of the adult population with a four-year college degree has gone up since the 70s, risen from 10% to 30%. Let me say, I graduated from college in 1975. At that time, the Black college going rate was about 4%. Yes. Today, it's about 25. Yeah. So, you know, we've seen improvement in all across the categories. However, this rise in college attainment does have a gender gap. And women are graduating from college at a much higher rate than men in recent years, accounting for almost all the growth in the college attainment since 1980. So when we talk about the number rising over the last 4 decades, we're talking about women's college attainment. And yet, it doesn't translate into dollars. And it's not just in the US. I found this really interesting to see that women are outpacing men's graduation in every country except Japan and Turkey, making up an increasingly important fraction of the skilled workforce. I'm wondering, in terms of the data that Bank of America has, whether some of that could be explained by women's concentration in what you called women-intensive industries.
So that's certainly part of it. There's another part of it, though, which is interesting to think about. If we look at, and I showed the graph of wage growth, it was by generation, but if we cut it by income level, what you'd see, and particularly over the last 5 years, is that lower income households' wages are growing much faster than higher income households. And a lot of those households are people who are in roles that don't require a college degree. So you've got that kind of closing the gap on it's not as much of a premium to go. And then if we were to look at not just the income level, but look at wealth, student loans.
Yes.
It's very expensive to go to college.
Yes.
And we're, and I don't have these statistics in my head, I should, but if we look at the number of households with student loans, the challenge is that trend, because yes, there's a premium, but does it cover the amount that you need to pay back and at that level? So you've got that issue too, which I think is an important one for families for people to consider. And again, if we look at the highest income families, which also generally have the highest amount of wealth, who are graduating from college without a loan, versus those who are trying to move up that need the loans, and then what does that do?
Sure.
Particularly if they're going to higher income roles, sectors that aren't growing as quickly as the lower income. So the calculus is a little bit different.
Got it. I want to make a public service announcement in response to what you just said. It matters where you choose to go. I'm sure everyone here understands that, but it really matters. I will tell some, be announcing to some, telling others what you already know. I've just finished writing a book, which is coming out in September. The title of it is Peril and Promise, College Leadership in Turbulent Times. And so we'll talk about that really on another day. But there is a chapter on college financing. And one of the things that's important to know is the difference between a nonprofit institution and a for-profit institution, educational institution. And of course, probably everyone in this room went to a nonprofit college or university. But there are lots of for-profit institutions, and the major folks who are attending those for-profit institutions are women of color.
Yes.
And they cost a lot and deliver very little. The graduation rates are low, the loan rates are high, the default loan rates are high because if you don't graduate, and even if you do graduate, the for-profit degrees are not well regarded in the marketplace. So people don't know that. They're signing up thinking, oh, I'm going to learn to be fill in the blank. But these for-profit institutions, many of them are just, degree mills, and even if you get the degree, you can't really use it. It's not translating. So especially if you're a single mom trying to advance your economic situation, and you see the ad, sign up here, you can go. There are certainly legitimate online programs that are not for profit, but the for-profit ones are really to be avoided. So if you know anyone in that situation, read the fine print.
I really appreciate this point because there's a great article authored by several economists, Derek Hamilton and Price being two of them, Umbrellas When It Doesn't Rain. And it really has a premise that education is not the great equalizer, right? Because there actually is a cost for education, but that does not translate into a return on investment in the marketplace, right? And we see when we disaggregate the data amongst women that Black women on average earn 62 cents on the dollar. It will take a Black woman 80 to 85 years to work so that they can comfortably retire at that rate compared to white men and some white women probably up 70 to 75 years. And so there's a roll around not just labor market discrimination, but also occupational segregation. So we're based here in Atlanta, and when we look at the data, we actually see as education increases, where people have more degrees, we actually saw that the income gap widened, right? And so my doctorate does not hold as much value in the labor market in Atlanta here for someone who does not look like me that may have a bachelor's or master's degree. And so as we're having this conversation around the role of systems, it's really bringing in an interdisciplinary analysis of how these systems, we're talking about education, we're talking about labor market, childcare, healthcare, interact in a dynamic and intentional way to produce these outcomes. They are producing the outcomes they were designed to produce. And I'm excited to think about how we leverage collective power so that the systems can be redesigned to produce different outcomes.
To that end, please. To that end, I want to talk about pay equity. Right? This is obviously a topic that many people think about. And the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, we know that name, Lilly Ledbetter. The Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Restoration Act was signed by President Obama in 2009. It was the first thing he signed 9 days after he took office. But her situation was precipitated by pay secrecy. She didn't know that she was making so much less than the men around her until somebody left an anonymous note in her locker, you know, with a number on it. And that's how she started to understand what was happening to her. This notion of pay secrecy is still a problem. One of the things we know is that women are, even though some states, for example, have passed laws, New York I know is one, where you have to be transparent about what, you know, the payrolls are, you know, the pay.
And you're not allowed to ask when you're hiring, how much are you making in your current job?
Yes, and that both of those things are positives,
Yeah.
but not true everywhere.
Right.
And I read an interesting statistic in this book which said women are more likely than men to be subject to paid transparency bans, meaning women are more likely to be working someplace where you're not allowed to talk about your salary.
Yeah.
So hold that thought. Here's another piece of information. In August 2017, the Trump administration announced that it was blocking an Obama-era rule requiring U.S. employers to report detailed pay data disaggregated by gender and race. That rule in the Obama era had been designed to make discrimination and wage discrepancies easier to identify and stamp out quickly. We will talk about some of the executive orders if we have time, but one that I want to just mention is often referred to as the anti-DEI executive order. But one of the things we know about that order is not only did it impose this anti-DEI instruction, but it also revoked the equal opportunity executive order that President Johnson signed in the 60s.
Yeah.
You didn't know? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, no. So we talk about the anti-DEI order. We don't talk about the revocation of the Equal Employment Act that Johnson signed. So the protections of that act have essentially been abandoned. So here we are in this moment trying to figure out how to address pay equity when we don't have access to the information and there really is no protection.
Yeah, I think, you know, what I would say is when we looked at that chart that I showed before that showed the pay gains, I attribute a lot of that to not the universal, but the laws that allowed that pay transparency on there. Yeah. So it allows the women to be more educated around, what should I be getting paid? Mm-hmm. But two, making it illegal to ask someone what they're making, because when you switch jobs, that's what the salary is.
Right.
As opposed to, oh, you were making this, okay, we'll just pay you up.
Yeah.
This. And so I think that that's a big component. It will be very interesting to see
how
we can follow up, in a year to see how that changes.
Can I just say though, that now 12 months ago, data protection and data integrity was not a priority on my agenda, and now it is. And so this is also an opportunity for the private sector, because the private sector has access to significant data. How do we leverage that so that we can continue to be able to really understand our landscape, understand people, places, but more importantly, what are the challenges and what are the opportunities? Because we have to think about data protections now more than ever, and we need to know where are people being consistently experiencing economic exclusion, because it is a constraint to our economy. It is a constraint to our overall performance and competitiveness. And so I think this is an opportunity for private sector leadership collectively.
Certainly, speaking to your point about data and access to it, when I was working on my book, I was looking up a lot of data about educational attainment, and the Institute of Education Statistics is one of the departments that no longer exists. Yeah. I mean, that was the department that was providing all this information that I was looking at, and is one of the things that has been on the DOGE chopping block. So there we have it. But I want to now talk about the great wealth transfer for a moment, if we could. I know there's going to be a panel later, not this afternoon, but later this morning on philanthropy. But I thought it would be important to include it in this conversation because, as you pointed out, there is going to be this great wealth transfer. And the question is, what will women, I love that song, What Happens When a Woman Takes Power, right? Yeah. What happens when a woman gets a lot of money? What does she do with it? 84 trillion in wealth is expected to transfer to younger generations from now through 2045. To put that in context, the global GDP in 2022 was 101 trillion. So 84 trillion is just going to pass into the hands of younger generations. Approximately 30 trillion, as you said, Liz, will be inherited by women in the next decade alone. And where's it coming from? From baby boomer men to their wives and children. What will they do with it? So I thought this was a really interesting question, and I wanted to lift up an example from this book, which is meaningful for a couple of reasons. You'll see why soon. It's the example of Catherine McCormick. Anybody know who Catherine McCormick was? I didn't know either until I read this book. But she inherited wealth from her own family. She grew up in a wealthy family and inherited wealth from her parents. But then she married a wealthy man who was Stanley McCormick, and they made tractors. That was his company. They made tractors. But anyway, he was very wealthy, and when he died in 1947, she was 72 years old, and she inherited $40 million, which in today's dollars would be $570 million. So she had not only the wealth that she came into the family with from her own family's inheritance, but then she got, $570 million from her husband's estate. At the time that she inherited that money, she decided, she was thinking, what could she do that would change the lives of women? And at the time, many states restricted the advertisement, sale, and use of contraceptives. You couldn't get contraceptives, basically. And, people were smuggling diaphragms, literally. So in that context, few people wanted to invest in contraceptive research, but she wanted to make a difference for women, and so she decided she was going to invest in contraceptive research. and she almost single-handedly funded the research that led to the birth control pill. So if you've ever taken a birth control pill, you have Catherine McCormick to thank for it. She started investing in that research in 1953. She spent approximately the equivalent of today's dollars, $21 million doing it. And in 1960, 7 years later, the pill was approved for contraceptive use. She died 7 years later at the age of 92. So she was 85 when finally this happened. And the story goes that she went to the drugstore and fulfilled a prescription. Just because she could. She wanted just because she could.
I love it.
When she died, she left a large portion of her estate to Planned Parenthood. Clearly, we can all recognize what difference her philanthropic investment made in the lives of probably every woman of a certain age. But what's happening now? We live in a time when reproductive rights are being rescinded.
Yes.
And because of the cost of childcare, many women are again being confronted with having to choose between child rearing and having a career. So, another data point. Until 1978, just 47 years ago, in most of our lifetimes, a woman could be fired from her job for getting pregnant. Today, women, not only women, sometimes men, but many women are leaving because they can't afford the childcare. And I want at this moment to say, I told Blythe I was going to mention her.
Yes.
Blythe Robinson will tell us that it's not because childcare workers are making a ton of money.
That's right.
We know that that is a very, it's the lowest paid sector of the education sector, those who care for young children. So we have both the challenge of trying to pay childcare workers a living wage, and yet also women and their families who can't afford childcare. What can we do about that? You want to start?
There's so many things wrapped into that context. What I appreciate about the anecdote is what do we do with the power we have? To be in this room, you are privileged. And what is the opportunity to really leverage your collective power? I want to be cautiously optimistic, but as I think about this wealth transfer, and I know that the black-white dollar gap is the highest it's ever been, I want to hope that women will stand in solidarity for democracy, for rights, and for justice, because there is power. And I think this is an opportunity moment to think about how networks can be organized to advocate for power that is representative. And so I want to start with that framing, because I think that's just a powerful commitment to intentionality for impact, because intent doesn't always translate into impact. There are several things I think we have to think about on the policy advocacy space. Childcare is like one of the top ones. And anyone in this room who is a parent, which should be a very grounding and humbling experience, has had to tackle with it, right? I was running behind this morning because my nanny was sick. And so I had to make alternative arrangements to get my daughter to school. And yet we live in a state where childcare has not been prioritized for the type of investment needed. We live in a country which on average we spend $15,000 in $5,000 every year in childcare, compared to other developed nations that are closer to $15,000. In our state, the income threshold to receive any subsidized support for childcare is $25,000 annually, which is, they're still holding on to FPL, federal poverty guidelines, below 200%, which they have not changed in decades. We live in a region where We have roughly 175,000 available spots, but we have over 225,000 children that need quality care. Blythe, her work at Sheltering Arms, is a call to action around our investment in this future workforce and future economy. And we are in a childcare crisis. Housing affordability continues to take the headlines, and it's important. And I'm not one for, oppression Olympics dialogue, but when we think about like childcare costs and how they have accelerated well over 30% of monthly income, we are experiencing a crisis. And so what's the advocacy opportunity for this, right? Because we're also in a state that has experienced a budget surplus. And how can those dollars be redirected so that we can make an investment in quality early learning education? The other piece I'd love for us to consider is the role of baby bonds, which other states are experimenting with. Because as we think about a wealth transfer, and this is why I have some cautious optimism, because any economist will tell you the biggest driver of wealth is wealth. So the wealth transfer will be, the beneficiaries of the wealth transfer will be people who have access to wealth. But what happens to people who are locked out of economic opportunity? And so this is a concern if power is not shared to reimagine inclusive economies that work for all. So a baby bonds policy could also be very, very helpful, instrumental in making sure that there's a level playing field. And what baby bonds is proposing is, let's look at trust funds for families who've been pushed to the economic fringes. Some go up to 50,000, so that there is a start for that child at 18 as they consider their career paths, because these are the families that are relying on assistance to level the playing field. But I will say, for us to really tackle the childcare piece, we have to restructure the funding streams for childcare. It needs to be revolutionized. It needs to be subsidized much more significantly publicly, and we need to have broader collective philanthropic investments around supporting tomorrow's workforce.
Great, thank you.
Can I just?
Yes, please.
I have like 6 strings I want to pull on here, but
Yeah,
let me try and do
please.
this. We talked about 30 trillion of transferring in the next 10 years, but as you said, that's not transferring equally, right? So that's important. The other thing that I think is very important that we see in our data is the way that women are investing philanthropically. And we generally don't look at surveys, but the private bank has done a survey and a study on philanthropy that has shown us that women tend to invest philanthropically more in ways that align with their values, which actually the McCormick story fits in with that. But women are also, so their the way that they invest their philanthropic dollars is that way, but the way that they invest their dollars, their investment dollars, is a lot more conservative. So if I think about and I look at the data on where women are going into retirement and in their 401ks, if I look at the level of a 401k investment of a median men versus women, women generally being paid less historically through their working life, so they're starting at a lower level, but they're also not investing in equities. They're taking the most conservative choice, or they're putting money in their 401k and just letting it sit in cash, which today is getting more than nothing. But we need to think about and educate women around appropriate risk taking so that they can participate in the wealth gain.
That's right. Perfect. I promised an opportunity to ask questions, so I know that we just have a little bit of time left, and so I do want to open the floor to our members or attendees who might like to ask a question. We have a hand over here.
Thank you. With the trend in vocational education as we knew it back in the 70s, and now we're calling it tech prep, and with the stats and the trends that you mentioned today about the education attainment levels not being equal to salary levels, what do you tell young women and young girls about post-secondary education?
That's for anyone.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to take it.
I think you're qualified on this one.
Which is to say, I think it is important to say it is still worthwhile to, you know, I made my speech earlier about where you go matters. You know, what school you attend will influence whether you complete your degree or not. Even in the not-for-profit world, where you start will matter. So we need good guidance around college choice, et cetera. Certainly even around affordability, what is, you know, many people talk about how expensive college is, and it can be, right? It certainly can be, but very few people pay the sticker price. So the question is understanding tuition discounting, and, you know, there's lots to understand. But certainly, what my parents said to me, get your education, it's important, certainly has proven to be true in my life. And they would also say, once you have it, no one can take it, right? And I think that coming from a, you know, black family perspective, that's what it was about. It's going to give you freedom.
And let me just say, while the data shows education is not the great equalizer, I am not anti-education. My daughter is going to get a degree. But I think about this in a supply and demand side, right? And so if we're thinking about future workforce, we need to make sure that we have a competitive and capable workforce for a future economy. But what is our role as women that are in the current workforce around creating a different type of demand, right? From the moment I became a parent, that has influenced decisions I make on how I show up in the workspace, because we have to create a different type of demand options for the young women that are coming into the future workforce. And that's where the advocacy, leadership, and commitment is important.
Yeah. You know, I think that one of the things that I want to say in the context of our conversation, the data you presented, Liz, the comments you've been making, Janelle, that we have kind of a good news, bad news story, right? That we see, you know, the wages are rising, we see greater education, we see greater participation in the workforce, but we also see, you know, the childcare burden, the concerns around still pay equity, et cetera. And thinking about this, I thought of a quote in Dr. King's last book, which is entitled, "Where do we go from here, chaos or community?" And he was writing about racial justice primarily, but he makes an observation that I think a lot about in this historical, cultural moment.
Yes.
And that is, he says, the line of progress is never straight. The inevitable counter-revolution that succeeds every period of progress is taking place. He said that in 1968, and he was talking about the pushback against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Yes. But I think about, you know, the progress that women as a group have made, that we've made, and the pushback against that progress. I mean, I think that that's what we're experiencing, right? Social progress over here, pushback against that progress, and that's a historical pattern that repeats periodically, and we're in the midst of such a pattern at the moment, if you ask me. And so one of the questions, and in that context, how many of you have heard about the trad wife movement? If not everybody's hands up. There's a whole thing on social media about the, quote, trad wife. The wife who wants to have a lot of, you know, Elon Musk has 11 children. I just want to say that.
13.
No, 11, one died. I read his, maybe he's had another one since the book was published. I read his biography. So anyway, he has a lot of children. J.D. Vance wants people to have more children. The birth rates are declining all over the world.
Yes.
Perhaps because of women's greater work participation, but birth rates are declining all over the world. In the United States, there's this whole stream of conversation about, you know, get busy, women. We need you to produce more, you know, more babies. We need more babies because the birth rate is declining. And I just think about this in the context of the rise and fall of economic equality and the McCormick story and the empowerment that came from being able to choose. Just where are we? I mean, do you see that pushback the way I'm seeing it?
So I live it and work it. Let me just say,
not to say that people shouldn't make choices to have families.
Absolutely.
I'm saying that, but to go back to this quote trad.
Yes. I think
experience.
And I think the trad is nestled in an agenda which is actually to anti-DEI.
Yes.
It actually is an anti-DEI agenda. And so the emphasis on trad is to actually, it's a numbers game around anti-DEI. And I just think I cannot leave here without saying DEI affects every single person in this room. And when you look, every single person. In fact, the largest beneficiaries of DEI are white women.
Yes.
Okay? The largest beneficiaries, 19% are C-suite executives. When we think about procurement and contracts, we're in the state of Georgia, 46% of small business women leaders, their revenue generated are white women. That number peels to single digits for Black women and Latinas, right? And so DEI affects everyone in this room. And so this trad wife agenda is really nestled in a broader anti-DEI, and what I will actually say is anti-justice agenda. And so the moment really is a reckoning around the acknowledgement that proposed policies are going to create disproportionate impacts, and we're starting to see that preliminary for people who did not think that they would experience negative impact. And so the broader conversation we need to have is, what is the opportunity to really demonstrate solidarity in a way we actually have not fully done before? This is an opportunity moment across races, across generations, across sectors, because this is the only path forward to protect democracy and to support a global economy that can be sustainable.
That seems like a great thing to end on. Well, the morning is just getting started and there's more to come. I want to take this opportunity to thank Liz for your wonderful presentation. The data speaks for itself, but you certainly helped make it clear for us.
And if anyone wants this data, it's available to you. You can subscribe, bankofamerica.com/institute, or send me an email. I'm happy to get it to you.
Thank you.
Great, and thank you, Janelle.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Everett Krisberg, who rediscovered her childhood schoolmate friend. Thank you, Dr. Janelle Williams. Thank you, Dr. Beverly Tatum. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Okay. I think now is the break.
I think we can go.
Thank you. That was a lot, right? We heard a lot of good information, a lot of timely information. Just want to bring our attention and our focus back. Girl Scouts, what? If you hear my voice, clap once. If you hear my voice, clap twice. Right. We have a break coming up, don't worry. We just have a bit more business to get to. Thank you so much. The information was timely, it was relevant. Thank you for your voices. Thank you for the data. Thank you for the lived experience. We'll plug Dr. Tatum's book. Hold on, Peril. It's coming in September. Peril. Yes, Peril and Promise. Peril and Promise, College Leadership in Turbulent Times, coming September 2025. Yes. Okay, so now I want to turn your attention to the screen. We want to thank our gracious sponsors who've made this event possible. If you look at the screen, presenting sponsors for this event, Georgia Pacific, our wonderful hosts, yay, and Liz Blake. Georgia Pacific continues to host this event each year and provide our meal, and we're grateful to them. And Liz Blake is our philanthropist who has continued to support this event year over year. When we talk about what women do with their wealth, Liz is doing it. Okay, now we have a video.
It doesn't matter if you're sweeping a floor or steering the ship, just be the best at whatever you're doing.
Do not be afraid. If this is something that you like, go find a mentor. Don't feel like you are alone. People want to see you succeed.
The person that came before you, they had to start somewhere as well. What's the worst that's going to happen? They're going to tell you no or you're going to fail. Okay, so you get up and do it again.
If you have a dream or a goal, it may take you a while to get there, but just never give up.
And you have to reassess and reevaluate that often. Your life will change, your family will change, and so your interests could also change.
Sometimes paths are winding, and you're going to find a lot of brand new skills along the way that can help you in a future role.
Women can do anything in this industry they choose to do, whether it's to be a supervisor, an operator, or sales manager, whatever they want to be, they can do it.
Thank you. Okay, so now we have a break, 15 minutes, 10:35. A little under 15 minutes. Please come back. We have another great panel for you. The restrooms are up here. I look like my mother with the glasses. The restrooms are up here. There's snacks and water. Please debrief with your colleagues and your neighbors here. Talk about what you want to see, what you're doing. And we'll see you back in 15 minutes. Thank you.